Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our next panel. This one on funding defense innovation and strengthening supply chains in the India-US partnership. This panel will take a little bit of a different direction than the conversations in the past, where we've talked about the partnerships in general. We'll focus primarily on the funding mechanisms that can make this possible and the financial tools to do that. We have an amazing set of panelists here, and they bring a wealth of experience to this conversation. We have Dr. Ajay Kumar, the former Indian Defense Secretary, who has been instrumental in shaping many of these programs, including IDEX. We have Vish Sahasranamam, the co-founder and CEO of Forge Innovation and Ventures, which is playing a critical role in helping Indian startups get into this ecosystem and providing the financial tools to help them. We have Major General Steve Bucky Bhutto, the military deputy at the Defense Innovation Unit, who's been involved in these programs. Bouncing around, we have Colleen Laughlin, who is the senior vice president and partner at the Washington office, which is a new role, and formerly the executive director for the Defense Innovation Board within the US Department of Defense. We have Dr. Nikhil Agarwal, managing director of the Foundation for Innovation and Technology Transfer, FITT, at IIT Delhi, who's driving academia industry partnerships. And finally, J.R. Gibbens from the Office of Strategic Capital, a brand new office, 2 years old at the Department of Defense, working to attract private capital to critical defense priorities and focusing primarily on supply chains. So with that, let's get right into the questions. First off, in terms of public-private partnerships, let's begin with their role in this and how they facilitate new financial tools. Let's go to Dr. Kumar, who's been so instrumental in setting up this entire infrastructure over the prior years. Tell us about how you thought about new financial tools through this and their role.
Thank you, Eric. So let me just share with you the perspective from the Indian policy framework. So, it's actually surprising that India opened up defense sector to the private industry way back in 2003. But if you look at it, by 2017-18, there was hardly any private sector participation. And I think that is the big gap that we were seeing initially. But later on, we have had several policy frameworks. IDEX has been one of the bigger ones where startups came into the picture. We have the Make 2 initiative. We have suo motu proposals. We have the DRDO's Development Production Partner policy framework. Each of this has helped in bringing the private sector much more. But if I were to say the two most important things which actually enable the private sector, and again from the Indian context, and sometimes these are not mentioned in any document. One is that in previously every time when we were actually saying we want the private industry and funding the private industry, the IP used to be with the government or the funding agency. So I think in IDEX for the first time we said that the IP would be with the developer, and that has been a game changer where the IP remains with the industry. And the second major thing, defense being such a monopolistic market, the fact that once the development has taken place, how quickly can you actually procure what has been produced? And I think in IDEX, we tried to make sure that once a product was developed by the startup, we made sure that it was procured. The only one thing which I think could go a long way, and I compliment the US government Department of Defense, is to have set up something like the Office of Strategic Capital, which I think is a wonderful initiative. It opens up opportunities for greater VC capital going into defense startups. In India, we have huge offset obligations which are outstanding. They run into several $1 billion. And I think it would do well, it will augur well if some of that money can actually be earmarked to converting into a venture capital which supports this kind of defense innovation. I think that could really go in promoting the defense innovation ecosystem. But I'll stop with that.
Thank you. And JR, your comments on that?
So first, thank you for the opportunity to be here. This is one of those panels I really look forward to because I know I'm going to learn a lot. So I'll try to keep my parts fairly brief so I can continue to kind of learn along with all of y'all. So within OSC, it is a unique approach. While we live in the Department of Defense and we spend a lot of time in the defense innovation ecosystem, we're not really focused on as much on kind of the defense technologies or in the innovation ecosystem. We're trying to attract capital in there. So when we talk about kind of public-private partnerships, that's the entire ecosystem that we're trying to influence, is that this isn't the DoD stepping in to solely finance something. It's trying to develop tools that act as catalysts to drive activity and really taking lessons learned. General previously spoke about 1957 and Sputnik. The Eisenhower administration in 58 did three things. They established DARPA, NASA, and this little program called the SBIC program, a Small Business Investment Company program. And the whole point of that was to kind of create public-private partnerships around the venture ecosystem. And if you follow the history of that, that with kind of the partnership with the Department of Defense, in large parts what established Silicon Valley and kind of the microprocessor ecosystem that emerged out of here has had a huge global impact. And so we're taking lessons from history and trying to figure out where can we apply that, again, not only within our own backyard, but as an important pillar of our program is looking internationally as well.
Well, Colleen, let's move to you. And again, thanks for coming from DC. We promised all of you sunshine here at Stanford, and we are delivering.
I'm getting it in spades.
And
I wore SPF.
In your time working in the Department of Defense, you've been thinking about these programs and ways to address partnerships internationally for a long time. Tell us about where you think some of the best advancements have come recently and what you see next.
Yeah, no, so thank you, DIU, IndusX, Gordian Knot, Hoover. I'm really glad to be here. I was mentioning to Eric earlier, I actually started my career in DoD as a civilian, and one of the first partnership programs I worked was actually the US-India account in DoD doing defense technology and export controls. So I know that triggers a lot of people, but it was an interesting time, and it's really amazing to kind of come back and see now where the relationship has gone and how much it's grown. I think one of the interesting things when we talk about public-private partnerships is, how do you start to synergize instead of doing these relationships sort of sequentially or linearly, right? Gov to gov, industry to industry, capital. We really have to start designing and integrating the way we do partnership collaboratively from the beginning. And so that has been an interesting area. When I had time to work in the department with the Defense Innovation Board, it was really looking at and understanding how do you goose all the different sectors of the defense innovation ecosystem such that they are mutually reinforcing, right, and then become force multipliers for each other. I think one of the areas we are still growing and adapting in, which to me is a positive thing, even though it can sometimes feel overwhelming and confusing, is the different sets of tools that we are learning how to apply to different, whether it's the innovation tech sector, whether it's through partnerships gov-gov, or some combination therein. But one of the interesting dynamics is really understanding how do you then weave strategic government priorities, national economic priorities, and then try to align the technology and innovation incentives and communities such that, again, we are building partnerships from the get-go, and you're applying all the tool sets that you have available.
Well, Dr. Agarwal, talk to us about the role of academia in this.
First of all, we have to understand that academia, defense, and industry has to work together. There is not like us and them. I don't know how we have designed this panel, but you see the US side and India side. So we have to mix together. First of all, it's, we can swap seats, I can get some more of the sun, though we have ample in India. So that's something which we have to start with. The defense industry worldwide has been a regulated and a closed industry. With the initiative of Secretary Dr. Ajay Kumar, we designed this program called IDEX, where the participation of startup was happening. Now, if you look at the total funding which is available today in the Indian ecosystem, whether it's defense or artificial intelligence or cybersecurity, I would say close to $10 to $15 billion worth of government funding which is available at the federal level, at the state level, various schemes. Today, India has emerged as the third largest startup economy in the world. We have close to 130 unicorns India-wide. Of course, in terms of Silicon Valley, that in unicorn numbers could be smaller. But what's more interesting to look at, there are more number of companies which has a potential to become unicorns, that we call them unicorns. We believe that by next 10 years' time, we can hit almost 1 million startups in various sectors. Now, a couple of examples I'll give it to you. Not just the defense, but particularly areas related to defense, cybersecurity, space technology. Now, space technology was something which was highly regulated, done by NASA, ISRO. The startups were not there. The large companies were not allowed to enter. And the last few years, the ISRO decided to open up the space sector. And that was, I would say, a little too much for the large companies. That is good news. Today, we have close to 500 space tech startups, and none of them are large companies. The really Tatas or Ambanis of the world, they are not able to understand the sector yet, and that has taken off. Now we are building up the 3D printed rockets. We are building composites, which can actually take a rocket to the Mars, which are building up right in Hyderabad, in Bangalore, in Noida, New Delhi. All these places, you see those kind of spurge which is happening, the innovation spurge that is happening. There's a role of academia that comes into play, because that research has happened in our labs. By design or by default, I would say we haven't commercialized the research that the way the American universities or the British universities do. I can give you hard statistics, 1 or 2 statistics, then I'll stop. For example, the institution where I work today, IIT Delhi, which is almost like a Stanford for India, we do almost 150 patents every year. But if you look at that's good news. Like, we do really good patents, high quality academic working on really high quality research. But if you look at the technology transfer, it is minuscule. It is single digit percentage. Now, if that starts changing, if we are able to translate from lab to market, that will redefine the whole cooperation, that it will redefine the new industry that is emerging.
And in complementing that, of course, we have the private sector perspective. Vish, tell us about your perspective as an investor in this area.
Sure. Firstly, thank you for the opportunity. So from an Indian perspective, I think if you look at where IDEX is, over 500 projects in the running, clearly about 750 to possibly 800 startups in India. I would classify them in one of 3 categories. They're defense first, they're defense also, they're defense only, right? So the amount of defense only in India is staggeringly high, right? It's different because, well, in the US you had Silicon Valley, 30 years of commercial enterprise, consumer tech was advancing, and then you had to look at how that tech can flow back into military. But in India, we kind of are looking at deep tech, growing, industrial, sort of commercial deep tech growing. So we're really seeing a situation where defense only, defense first, startups being a lot more in number, right? Now, so if you really look at from an investment standpoint, the traditional, venture capital is not going to find that, very attractive for obvious reasons. There is no question, contesting that argument. Instead, if you were to look at an alternative source of what I call strategic capital, right, which is really the large industrial majors, the private sector, some of whom are here, and then the public sector, right? We have 16 defense public sector enterprises in India. How can we really look at strategic sort of industrial capital coming in to these, defense only, defense first startups much early on in the game? And really the opportunity for the industrial majors is to unlock value throughout the life cycle of a defense tech national security venture, right? So you have technological value to be unlocked at the very early upstream level. You've got organizational value. Some of the DNA from the startup, if it were to flow back into the enterprise, would create magic. And then you have of course, commercial value and strategic sort of financial value, right? So I think what we need to push a lot more is around these integrations, partnerships where, those startups, if you take IDEX, those startups that are doing well, they're getting into the last stages of clearing trials, getting into procurement. I think we need to start asking the question, how soon can they get integrated into these industrial majors? Because that strategic capital will obviously offset the absence of venture capital by a big way. One. Second, we're also talking about sort of resilient supply chains. Now, one of the sort of personal problems that I have, or sort of fears that I have, is how many of these projects that successfully complete trials through IDEX and get to a small order procurement sort of milestone are actually going to be able to integrate back into the supply chain to be able to deliver the larger order, right? Because please understand that sort of military procurement and industrial production supply chains are organized and operated to be more in favor of mature mainstream technologies, not so much nascent technologies. Because at the end of the day, the procurement manager is going to have risk in terms of integrating these smaller ones who haven't delivered in large scale into the supply chain. So I think we've got to work that out. So any amount of capital that can go into sort of solving those issues, I think would be manyfold times more impactful than sort of money going in and money coming out. That would be my submission. Yeah.
Well, let's build on that to talk about the different types of capital. General Bhutto, you've been working on this for at least a decade and making incredible strides at the Defense Innovation Unit, looking at the different types of financial tools. And when we're talking about this, we're talking about contracts, we're talking about grants, awards, prizes, but also debt and equity, and working with the venture capital community, private equity. You've done so much here. For the next segment, let's go ahead and open this to everyone, but if General Bhutto, if you would get us started.
Sure. I think first what I'd like to do, just you mentioned I'm long in the tooth on this, and next April, it will have been 10 years since Secretary of Defense Ash Carter made his speech here on campus, not far from here, announcing that he was going to create this special unit in DoD to work on commercial innovation and bringing that technology into the department. And of course, it went over resoundingly well here, but most people thought he was crazy and like picking at a wound, which for those of you who are not familiar with the way we procure things in the U.S. Department of Defense, it's in concert with a planning, programming, budget, and execution strategy that was really conceived in the year I was born, 1963, and it's perpetuated all the way up until really DIU showed up on scene. Today, under Doug Beck's leadership, we're not just doing our engagements with the commercial sector, but we have a division that focuses on policy. Policy can often be an inhibitor of innovation. We have a different division that's focused on global partnerships and how we build and leverage relationships with countries like India and their commercial sectors. So I think first and foremost, I think in order to really tap into the incredible wealth that is in the private sector, the government has to show signs that we're more able and willing to adapt to the environment in which we live, not the one in which we were born into, and that's really important. In around the 1980s, that was the inflection point where really the commercial sector really started taking on the burden and really showing the fruits of doing research and development or innovation more so than the government. And today, more than 4 times the amount of money is spent in the commercial sector on R&D in the United States, and this is the destiny for India as well. You mentioned defense-only companies, and that is like the kiss of death in our model. However, we were we kind of took some risk, and we've had a couple companies like Shield AI, Anduril, that came in and said, hey, we want to work on defense-only markets. And we go, oh my gosh, and this is going to be horrible. They're going to like ruin our model. But they proved to be able to do that very effectively. So on the capital side, I think the most important thing is that we want to leverage the tremendous amount of capital that's out there. A typical DIU project has at least 10 times more private investment than government money going into it, sometimes even 4 times that. But we have to be willing to award contracts quickly, flexibly, and also make sure that we send a strong demand signal out in order for the markets to respond to it. We have to follow that up with meaningful contracts. And whatever we buy, we have to show that we are willing to integrate it, not just augment military capabilities, but truly integrate it with everything that we do so it's used every day. It becomes part of the fabric for national security. So the innovators, and the other reason why we're boots on the ground here in Silicon Valley is so that we can forge relationships on trust, theme of the day, with the investment community. So it's really important that we can have good conversations with the investors, and also they can help us, and we can work together mutually to make sure that that the best companies that whether they're in India or the United States, are not getting adversarial or the type of investment that could be problematic for them as they mature.
Well, I'll jump in and say a couple of things real quick. Like, what's so incredibly powerful, and if you've had a chance to kind of see the development of DIU over the years, it's such an incredible tool from a defense capability standpoint for a couple of reasons. One, from the early days, incentives are aligned. So there's other, like through SBIR programs or things, there are easy on-ramps into a initial kind of federal contract, but there's no indication that's ever going to transition. And so you can get a lot of entrepreneurs that are kind of take their eyes off of the actual business plan, because now they have an opportunity to kind of jump in and kind of iterate on this defense version of it, even though if they're building something that kind of live in the component space, there's never going to be a defense program that's going to acquire or move into an acquisition program for their specific component. So the incentives are aligned on very, very early. And then the other part is just the demand signal part. So from an OSC perspective, the areas where defense capabilities are paramount, if we can be a better customer, and if we can generate that demand signal, which usually in the DoD it's a pretty meaningful demand signal, that allows the market forces to work. Mm-hmm. From an OSC perspective, we're looking at kind of adjacent to that. So as I said earlier, we're not necessarily spending a lot of time on kind of very specific bespoke defense capabilities, but more broadly across the supply chain, because we have a significant amount of kind of components and parts and pieces and things that flow into defense capabilities, but will never be a program of record or never be anything we acquire directly. And so we've seen over years, there's been a lot of risk kind of embedded into that ecosystem and into those supply chains, because we haven't really had a seat at the table, because as we're talking about, a lot of that funding and a lot of those business decisions are made purely for commercial and private sector reasons. And so what we're trying to do is identify those areas. Microprocessors would be a good example. If you look through the ecosystem out here, that the large amounts of both federal and private and public dollars that flow into that create an incredible kind of ecosystem, but at the end of the day, the Department of Defense is never going to acquire a microprocessor directly, but we sure hope the best versions of them wind up in the systems our warfighters use. And so we're looking for the ability to kind of identify those areas and then balance out the capital stack by bringing tools that allow equity investors to go deploy more capital into the areas that we think are important. And in some cases, then we will directly underwrite and provide capital into specific companies or through guarantee structures with banks. And so we're trying to think of how do we round out that capital stack so that entrepreneurs and companies that want to address some of these important areas that are maybe a little less efficient use of capital in an enterprise software business, that they have access to those capital, that we can price the capital right, that winds up being a win-win for the investors as well.
So I'll jump in.
Go ahead.
So in defense sector, something what we need is called patient capital. Mm-hmm. Majority of what I have seen across the world, the venture capital does not have that kind of patience. They require the business model to at least start delivering in 3 years, 4 years time. Mm. So, but you may need 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, even 20 years before the actual impact of that investment can seen into pharmaceutical, defense. We have seen those sectors. Mm-hmm. So something which I must put in front, there are certain initiatives with the government of India that has been done, which is certainly unique in certain nature. So if you look at the defense sector as a whole, you cannot just say defense startups, like as the Vish has certainly pointed out. So you have to look at the quantum computing, you have to look at artificial intelligence, you have to look at cybersecurity, you have to look at the R&D investment which is going into the private sector. You have to look at the money that will pump into the universities. So last 1 year, I give you a couple of statistics that will be useful for our audience also. some of the initiatives the government of India has taken, and that's something which are modeled, I would say, inspired from the United States. You have the whole basis of innovation today in US is NSF, if you look at. The whole NSF funding which pumped into the universities commercialized, those commercialized, that models eventually made semiconductors and equipments and others, so there is a whole lot of literature that is available. In India, unfortunately, we didn't have that kind of funding available. So now the government of India has set up almost $5 billion NRF, National Research Foundation, that is taking shape. That money will come into the university's research. Now, on top of it, this budget, the government has also announced $12 billion patient capital to fund the R&D into the private sector. Now, patient capital means is not 5 years, 10 years, it is going 50 years. 50 years of soft loan. So that was like, even we thought initially when we read it, there may be misprint. Because how do you invest in something for 50 years? The public money. But that was it. So that was fantastic, I would say. Another couple of initiatives the government has done is almost $1.5 billion worth of quantum mission. $1 billion quantum mission, $1.2 billion AI mission. Now, all these things, if you look at collectively, that constitute as a startup ecosystem and a defense ecosystem, which will start culminating over a period of time. So that kind of approach is needed from the federal level first. Then the venture industry start having that confidence. Okay, there is something to back it up. There is something fundamentally right which is happening. And there you see the private capital coming in. Now, on an average, if I'm not wrong, if the government put $1, the private sector leverage can be up to $4 to $5. So if we start calculating this whole amount of money, we are talking about in India, which is still, we are not a developed country yet, I would say. We are talking about close to $20 billion US, which is available to us. So at the leverage side, we can have 100 billion leverage is coming on straightforward into R&D and the patient capital. So that should be a game changer, I would say, in the next 5 years, 10 years time. By 2035, I'm quite hopeful that we will start producing innovation at the rate of what the US is doing.
Dr. Kumar.
Yeah, I just wanted to, if I may, I think when we look at defense innovation, particularly in the context of India and the US, it's a great beginning, and the two governments have taken the leadership role and having set this whole mechanism, IndusX has been set up. But really to sustain it in the future, it will have to be market driven. And therefore, the point which you raised, of having market-related financial instruments will be absolutely essential to drive this. Now, I am reminded of the IT sector growth and how the two countries partnered, and it is sustained over 3 decades now or so. I think we need to visualize a defense innovation ecosystem which is kind of similar to the one which has got developed in the IT sector between India and the US, where the two countries are working together and trying to help each other in the growth. In this, there are two clear opportunities that one sees, as I see at least, especially in the equities instrument. One is that there are, Vish mentioned about large number of defense startups which are coming up today in deep tech areas, emerging technology areas. They need venture capital. And we need to create mechanisms by which the information about what's happening in India flows into the venture capital industry in the US, which today is not there. And that's something on which we should possibly look at how there could be VC to VC collaboration, which could actually drive this kind of initiative. And the second is, I think, there are another trend that I'm seeing, which is Indian startups, Indian defense startups, who have already started creating footholds in the US market, either for defense through the OEMs or sometimes for the civil market in US. And they need to be able to cater to the US market, they need a totally different level of capital. Whatever money they have raised in the Indian market is just not enough. And we need mechanisms to see how these startups, and I have specific startups in mind because I've been working with some of them. So who are actually, how do you create, really, scale up in technology for them? So this is two areas of equity markets needs to develop, which will be able to create greater business to business linkage. Second is on the contract side, I think. On contract side, I think one improvement on the IndusX framework, I think, which which possibly needs to be thought through, and there's no easy answer to this one, is we are doing joint challenges now. We have done several, and I'm sure there'll be some successes because there's smart people on both sides. But today, these are running like parallel lines, two parallel railway tracks. The US startups are developing on the US side, the Indian startups are developing. Let's assume for a moment that if a US startup is actually able to find a solution to the problem, what is the mechanism by which the Indian defense forces are able to procure this and use it for their own? Today, there is no mechanism, and it will be treated as actually import, and so therefore, the jointness is getting lost somewhere. I mean, if you're talking about joint, and if one of these startups is able to solve that problem to the satisfaction of the user force, there should be a mechanism by which this could be contracted by either country. And I don't know, at least I'm not aware of any mechanism that exists. And the second thing is, I think, given the current geopolitical situation, there is increasing demand on the US OEMs, defense OEMs, to get out of the supply chain, get the supply chain migrated from China into other countries, and India is a great market to do that. How do we get contracting terms so that we are able to get more and more Indian suppliers, a trustworthy supply chain, which is able to cater to the foreign OEMs, would be yet another contracting arrangement. Again, I go back to the IT industry. The IT outsourcing started because this contract framework was developed by then IBM, who was one of the pioneers of outsourcing in the, in India at least. And that framework was used by a whole lot of companies thereafter to start outsourcing from India. So similar framework through which defense OEMs could actually source from India could make a huge difference, in my opinion. Thank you.
I think Dr. Ajay Kumar is alluding to reciprocal procurement, right? And that doesn't have to happen at the military level, because at the end of the day, if we can get the OEs in the two countries to actually join hands, some of this reciprocal, not procurement, but at least supply chain integration could be a near-term goal to get to, right? See, at the end of the day, innovation, at least in deep, emerging futuristic technologies, innovation happens at the component subsystem level, whereas procurement, military procurement, and supply chain integration happens at, and industrial production happens at a system platform product level, right? So they're basically two different levels. And how do we get these things to come together? So we need to have those jointness at multiple levels in the value chain in order for us to be able to see this go from 1 + 1 = 11 kind of a scenario. That's the value unlock that we need to look at. Building on the defense also, defense only, defense first categorization that I spoke about. See, it's in steady state, we're going to have, at least we would expect more number of startups to get to defense also, move from defense first and defense only to defense also. So we talk a lot about dual use, but one of the things that I've started noticing, even in India, we're a very early ecosystem when it comes to defense technologies and startups, but we're actually seeing what I call multi-use within the strategic sector, right? So we can think of systems that are developed, sort of prototype proven for, say, the Indian Army will have utility for the Air Force or for the Navy. Now, we're not sure how much of that visibility is built into the system proactively. If there is some, some two friends in the Army and the Navy, maybe, serendipitously, we can expect them to talk to each other and maybe create pathways for one tech to go from one, services to the other. But then, can there be a more organized, systematic way of doing it? So that dual use, multi-use, what it really does is creates a 2x2, right? So if you're high on dual use, if you're high on multi-use, that top right has to be very attractive for venture capital. And to be able to get those startups to that top right corner is I think, the job that large industrial majors and the startups will have to work together. So if you can sort of create this jointness between Indian primes and American primes, particularly the Indian defense public sector undertakings, I think that would be a good step in that right direction.
I think it's important that as part of the conversation, we recognize there's two environments. There's the research and development side, which starts with the basic research at universities, culminates at something like, for the US, DARPA, right? They're really trying to figure out what's the next new thing. And then on the innovation side, innovation versus invention, innovation side, it also starts at the small business innovative research side, and it grows through our innovation ecosystem to an organization like DIU. The most important thing, though, is that we can move rapidly in one. The other one, we don't really control the timing of. Both of them require time-phased investment, generally philanthropy and other things like that through government grants on the research side. And then on the innovation side, private capital, which is so very important that we just don't try to prescribe an output or narrowly define a problem, but to really give a more complete problem set that has commercial relevance to these companies so that they can go after it and use today's technology. The most disruptive things we've found in 10 years is really going out and giving companies to provide us with software-defined solutions, right? And now today, AI-enabled solutions, using the most advanced technology that represents the true state-of-the-art today. If you go back to what I said previously, the way that we buy defense things, we lock the technology 10 or 20 years back because that's how the acquisition system reduces risk. And so in innovation and the commercial adoption, we don't do that at all. We want them to use the most available emergent technology today, and we want to be part of the process that helps them to move rapidly through various levels of technology readiness so that they can bring a commercial product not just to help us with defense, but also to market, which is where we really benefit in the long run. SpaceX, if you look at their Starship, that represents about a $5 billion investment. And we have very little, if any, money in it on the government side, but we're going to be the direct benefactors of it because it's pursuing a commercial marketplace. And having the relationships so that we can leverage that. There's companies, great companies beyond our borders. We make a point at DIU of being able to write contracts for prototyping, doing challenges with foreign companies, and we don't want them to become U.S. subsidiaries unless they absolutely need to. And in fact, we tell them, put the brakes on, unless it's a European company, say put the brakes on, because we need to establish that there's actually a demand signal that requires you to have a U.S. subsidiary, usually for some of the more specialized government markets. But that's really, to see the amount of transformation in the U.S. in the last 10 years has been really remarkable. And then we're invested in helping you to do this as well through this collaborative partnership.
What we've heard here are a number of perspectives on the different financial tools that we could use. In a few moments, we'll get to where do we need to go with this? How can we actually strengthen the India-U.S. relationship with these tools? And we'll get to some tangible examples. The other portion of this discussion is on supply chains. Now, Colleen, let's go to you. You've been working on contested logistics the last while, and let's hear some of your ideas about where this could go in the international domain.
Yeah, no, thank you. Just before I transitioned into the private sector, one of the topics I was working on for the deputy was looking at strategic competition issues related to China and data analytics, and contested logistics was an area we were really trying to unpack. But the issue is we were talking about contested logistics. There's actually a lot of different ways to describe it: contested, congested, constrained, and they're going to be both geopolitical, climate issues that impact, but also adversarial actions. And so, as we were thinking about that, it really becomes an issue of how do you think about how you better integrate? Well, first, how do you get transparency through your supply chains? How do you ensure that they are clean? But then how do you start thinking about a more integrated defense industrial base, if you will, right? Where you're thinking through co-production, co-development, co-sustainment in a unique and dynamic way that can be responsive to the different needs. And this, I think, spans issues, everything from sort of critical minerals to software to, how we move things from sort of fort to port or factory to port. But then also understanding that underlying those issues, cybersecurity is going to be a major dynamic, right? If things are shut down and you cannot move things at all, that's going to be a big issue. And so I think, on that front, really thinking through how we work with allies and partners, and particularly in the Asia Pacific, thinking about what that integration looks like and how we can, again, apply. And I think in the earlier discussion we were talking about, who are the drivers of these kind of partnerships and sort of, the Office of the Secretary of Defense for policy. How can an organization like that help corral and set the right incentives both between the two governments, but then also within I would offer innovation and industrial base. I sort of think of those as two unique beasts. I don't know if that's always right, but there's different tools that you're going to be able to use and apply in different parts of the ecosystem, obviously academia being on the more innovation side, the research side, and then your OEMs really having to think about like what they're doing on the industrial base side. And so, how you move across that continuum to then, again, always, right, how do you design integration in from the beginning so that you are relying on each other instead of having it be an afterthought, because then you leave enough seams there that I think sort of creates drag across the relationship and across the effectiveness of what you're trying to achieve.
JR, let's add on to that. So let's step back 4 years, and you are in the Department of Defense as a reservist working on administering the Defense Production Act during COVID. Some of those insights led to the formation of the Office of Strategic Capital, and you'd had those insights. Tell us a little bit about what you saw then as far as financial tools needed within these supply chains. The second piece, how that can relate to the international domain.
Yeah. Thanks, Eric. So yeah, the origin, a big part of OSC and the team that came together around this, including Eric, was a group that was brought kind of out of government and private sector during COVID. So it was kind of a all nation, almost all of world effort to respond to that. And outside of kind of broader geopolitical events that are kind of impacting our decision making today, there was just a significant geopolitical event that shut down supply chains just from the pandemic side. And in that, it started revealing degrees of dependency that I think we all kind of anecdotally knew about, but probably didn't fully appreciate and weren't necessarily being thoughtful and staying ahead of. And so from a policy perspective, you kind of had this team that was coming together out of Wall Street and other Silicon Valley, very much take a market approach to life and the problems we're trying to solve, but realizing that the market probably wasn't correcting as quickly as we felt was important or necessary for national and economic security purposes. But how can we kind of be a catalyst without being kind of heavy-handed and how can we drive some activity there? So that was the original concept, is how can we create an incentive structure to leverage kind of relative strengths for strategic competition. And it shifted from there really into a technology lens, so kind of moved out of supply chains and into technology. And now here we are a couple years into it, and we're really kind of back in supply chains, because as we look at the investment thesis around very specific technology areas, we still have high degrees of dependency on parts of the world that may not share our view of what that reciprocity or what the what a trade agreement should look like, or how we all kind of grow this together. And so now we're back in supply chain, and we're still back with the same thesis of how do we leverage relative strengths for competitive advantage. And so not everything exists here in the U.S., nor should it. And we have amazing partners and allies. If you look at this event, it really kind of identifies what we're trying to work with. We have incredible technologists, incredible investments. We have amazing capital markets, and we have incredible partners and allies. How do we kind of bring those things together and create an incentive structure to go, kind of shift out of one area and really move forward together to go solve these problems? So yeah, kind of started in the supply chain area, moved to technology. We're kind of back to supply chain, and then looking at it, when you look at supply chain, we touched a second ago. The DoD itself as a customer isn't a big enough customer in most of these supply chains to really move the needle, and so we have to have kind of an adjacent approach to have a seat at the table in some of these conversations.
As a final question before we open it to audience questions, let's talk about the future of this and what we can actually do. Let's do some rapid fire responses, see if you can give us the answer and maybe the playbook for where we go from here, but opening it up to anyone for some brief comments. Future of using these new funding mechanisms to strengthen the partnership. Dr. Kumar.
I think we have to recognize that we are in times where the strategic alignment is going to stay for a while, especially in the Indo-Pacific. And that is going to drive a lot of this agenda. We're talking of supply chains, we're talking of how we are going to work together in terms of creating defense innovation ecosystems. Second is, so that is one, something which will determine how we go going forward. The second is, I think, the geography, the fact that India is midway between, the Atlantic and the Pacific Rim, is a huge geographical strategic location with creating a defense production base which is closer to the Pacific. And that geography is going to define a lot of this. And we have started seeing already, the Pacific Fleet getting MRO and repair services in India. This has not been leveraged enough. We're talking supply chains, but the geography itself is also going to get leveraged going forward in future. I think that's going to become an important part of it. But these are two dimensions from a strategic perspective. But I think this other pillar through which we can look at future is the pure innovation perspective. And the sheer fact that India's demography and the innovation ecosystem, which has largely been dormant in India and has now started unfolding with a large startup ecosystem in defense and otherwise, I think, and the well-mature innovation system in the US, and the way the emerging technologies are rapidly growing and changing, I think this is also going to define the collaboration of these two countries. And I think this point was made very well by Dr. Rice and John in the morning, that this is the other big pillar of this, in my view, that in future the sheer momentum of these innovation ecosystems will work together, and which will be for welfare of both US, India, and I think in larger world, put together, we should be able to do much better than what, let's say, China or Russia can do. And I think that's going to be a defining feature in terms of the innovation ecosystems away from the strategic perspective.
Time for two more comments.
Oh, I was going to say, I would offer, I think blueprints for speed are really important. And by that, I mean, you won't be able to predict kind of where the synergy is coming from. It could be on the scientific side, where you've had a new breakthrough in R&D, or it could be on the emerging, sort of understanding there's a capability gap and sort of being able to fill that. And I think we have to kind of break through the stovepipes of both democracies, so, both systems, so that you can bring together those ecosystem players that are really needed in that moment, right? So if it's on the R&D side, how do you bring together your academia, your NSFs? And then on the far right, if it's a capability you're losing or that you're needing to gain advantage in, how do you leverage organizations like DIU and the tools are going to look different across the spectrum, and we just have to be able to sort of pull those together very quickly. So, folks on the inside in the government have to become experts on the swath of tools available, and I think folks on the outside also have to become expert in understanding, too, what are the different levers and kind of partnerships that can be formed across that continuum, and then ideally evolve, right, from R&D into production prototype.
Fish.
Yeah. So to me, I think the one place where we're going to see a lot of value unlock in the future, particularly in defense value chains, is going to be just getting the industrial majors to innovate faster and better with startups as partners. I think that integration is what I would really put my money on, right? And so if there are startups out there that can potentially, engage with the large OEs and drive this multi-use, dual-use potential, I think those are the startups that will start attracting venture capital more than others. And what that will allow, in turn, in terms of value creation, is for these OEs that sort of acquire these technology portfolios to be able to move faster and be able to be sort of ahead of the curve in being able to serve the demands of what we're seeing in terms of evolving military doctrines and warfighting sort of capabilities. I think those capability end states, if we were to do a backcasting and then ask the question, which tech can really get us to those capability end states faster and better, I think the OEs will start looking at startups as the answers. So that integration to me looks to be the sort of cornerstone, and maybe IndusX can work on strengthening those partnerships on both sides of the equation. Would be sort of my interest area to look into. Yeah.
Ish, thank you. We have 10 minutes left, and so let's open this up to Q&A. Please.
Leicester Capital, a deep tech investor both in the US and in India. So great to see Dr. Ajay Kumar here. I wanted to pick, and I served in the US administration, the Obama administration, so it's great to see from the early days of DTTI where the relationship has gone. So compliments to everybody who's been working on it. I wanted to pick up on a point that Dr. Ajay Kumar alluded to, which is about the use of defense offsets. I think this is an area where if you have a policy to apply, to give credit for investments in venture funds, that could be very, very valuable. Some countries have played with this idea, and often the model involves kind of a multiple that you apply. So if, say, a company invests $10 million, you might get a 10x multiple, which is like $100 million towards an offset. That could be a very substantial way of unlocking resources towards deep tech innovation. And deep tech does, as many mentioned, deep tech investing does take a very special characteristic, kind of a patience for the long term, as well as sensitivity to technologies. And defense contractors, defense OEMs would be great LPs in funds that can understand both these aspects. So I want you to consider putting that on the agenda to advance the relationship.
Absolutely. So first of all, of course, I am on your side of the fence. I'm not no more part of the government, but I think it's definitely something which is a very easy way of starting something, which will be similar to what OSC is doing, and it will go a long way in strengthening this defense innovation ecosystem. I totally endorse your view.
Ryan Morfin from Iron Gate Capital. I'd like to ask both sides of the Indian delegation and the U.S. delegation, what are 2 or 3 segments in particular that you think are the most prime for collaboration and co-development from your perspective, given the problem sets we're facing?
From our side, I would say the most obvious thing would be the new upcoming technologies. So there are certain technologies which are already developed. So for example, everybody's talking about AI. So AI has maturing to a certain stage. So certainly there is an opportunity for partnership, but the new technologies, which are upcoming technologies, for example, quantum. So quantum would be the most exciting up in all. I would say the AI will look like a kid if we have started developing quantum to its full potential. And the second, I would think of space technologies, because that's a new livable space or a war space, whatever you can think of. These are the areas where both the countries have shown its might. There are not many countries across the world which has a mature space ecosystem the way India and US has. So there is an opportunity of co-creation and co-development. The new areas, of course, like quantum, and could be in pharmaceutical, because India has demonstrated that we can be the vaccine supplier to the world. But at the same time, the innovation is happening in US. So somewhere we talked about the supply chain. So one side we have to secure about the supply chain, another side the security about the innovation. So innovation and supply chain come together. I think that would be a game changer for the entire world.
If I could, I would just say that we've grown to recognize that success breeds success. The most innovative, disruptive hardware companies today are second generation. They started off being software companies, right? Doing things like PayPal and Amazon Web Services and things like this. So the interesting thing is that what you need is a path for innovators to basically achieve greatness and then have the capital to go and pursue other activities. We can't prescribe those in the government. One of my mentors who was one of the early CTOs at Hewlett Packard always emphasized to me that always choose a team over the technology. Great teams will always solve a tough problem. Technologies are great, but maybe the team's not so good. And these are all basic things from the investor community. But I think we have to have an eye on tracking the talent. We have to have a system so that those talented individuals can do things and on a path to scale, right? So they can achieve great things for the commercial and defense communities, and then go on to do even greater things.
Let's open it up for one more question.
Okay. I was going to ask about technology to turn on the microphone, but we figured that out. My name is Jeffrey Levine. I'm with NVIDIA, and I'm curious about when you're looking at innovation. I mean, you mentioned quantum computing, and that's fascinating, but the road to 1,000 to 10,000 qubits, that's a journey. I also heard some talk about climate security, and I'm interested from your perspective of how are you looking to innovate and prepare, taking advantage of things like remote sensing, physical AI, edge compute, AI agents, to really prepare and adjust for climate security, because there's these unknowns, right? It hits you when you least expect it, and the floods come. It's disruptive to supply chain. So I'm kind of curious how you're looking specifically around what's more in front of us over the next 12 to 36 months versus in the 30s. How are you utilizing that to prepare for climate security?
So I would offer that I think when we think about opportunities to collaborate, a lot of it too is like, what's the problems you're trying to solve? And if you look at between US and India, yes, quantum is going to be 30, 50 years out, but when we start talking about climate issues, we start talking about biotech, I think that's why, what's your demand and supply drivers on those? And, starting to really address, I think, some of these issues around, and I know we're at a defense-flavored conference, but climate, health, housing security, right? Different manufacturing techniques that will sort of change how people live their day-to-day. I actually think it's kind of curating those problem areas that we can apply technologies to have more immediate impact in people's day-to-day lives, that you want to balance out with the, what are you doing on quantum looking 50 years out, that we haven't quite figured out where we're going to use it in defense, much less tap into the potential so that it affects real people's lives.
I would just add that one of the things we're very passionate about is making sure that the right innovators in our ecosystem have access to the very best technology that comes out of your company, and sometimes that's a little bit of a challenge because of market demand. But those are areas where we should be working together collaboratively. There's a lot of companies in Silicon Valley and elsewhere that we have very strong relationships with. They're just not contractual, because we both recognize the importance of making sure that we have ready access to the most compelling technologies that can redefine how we solve problems, or revisit old problems that we kind of wrote off because we just didn't have the computational or other capabilities at the time.
General Bhutto, thank you. And what we've heard throughout this panel today are a few themes. First off, Dr. Rice, John Chambers, Dr. Kumar, you've all mentioned how we need to use the enormous strength and momentum that we have here, that there is no end to the accomplishments if we can work together to use these tools, and specifically for this panel, these financial tools. We've talked about the need for different tools for different purposes, whether that's component level technologies that often need longer term capital through debt or through procurement, or through equity investments, or whatever it might be. And if we can harness those tools for the partnership in the right way and get the policies right, that we can make tremendous progress. Jerry, you also mentioned an important thing with the idea that the crises that we've had in the past have revealed some of our vulnerabilities, particularly in supply chains, and the ways that we use these financial tools. So this represents an opportunity for us to get ahead of this before a crisis strikes, and for us to be able to be much more proactive in the use of these tools. Thank you to each of our panelists for joining us here. Such a wealth of experience across so many different perspectives from government and investment in the private sector.